The day Elsie Kingsley arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, 3 different men laughed at her within the first hour of her stepping off the stagecoach, and not a single one of them would ever forget the day they realized their mistake. She came from St. Louis, Missouri, carrying a worn leather satchel, a small cedar trunk that had belonged to her mother, and the kind of stillness about her that made people uneasy in the way that deep water makes people uneasy, not because it is dangerous, but because they cannot see the bottom of it. She was 22 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned neatly beneath a practical bonnet, hazel eyes that moved slowly and deliberately over everything they settled upon, and hands that were already calloused from years of working her father's print shop before consumption took him in the winter of 1881. She had answered an advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch placed by a man named Gerald Holt, who ran a dry goods store in Caldwell and needed a bookkeeper and shop assistant. The advertisement had promised fair wages, decent lodging above the store, and the opportunity to build a respectable life on the frontier. Elsie had read it 4 times, folded it carefully, and then sat with it in her lap for 2 full days before she decided that a life spent waiting in St. Louis for something to change was no life at all. The first man who laughed was the stagecoach driver, who looked her over as she stepped down onto the dusty Main Street and said to his companion, loud enough for her to hear, that Gerald Holt must be desperate if he was importing quiet little church mice from Missouri to run his business. The second was Gerald Holt himself, who had expected someone more robust in appearance and manner, and who said, with the particular cruelty of a man who considers himself practical, that she hardly looked like she could survive a Kansas summer, let alone manage his inventory. The third was a man leaning against the post outside the saloon across the street, who said nothing, but laughed freely and openly in a way that Elsie did not miss. She said nothing to any of them. She signed Gerald Holt's employment papers with her own pen, which she produced from her satchel with quiet efficiency, checked the figures on his ledger within the first afternoon, and found 3 errors in his accounts that had been costing him money for the better part of 6 months. And by the end of her first week in Caldwell, Gerald Holt had stopped laughing and started paying close attention to everything she did. But the town itself had formed its opinion quickly, the way frontier towns always did, because survival on the Kansas plains in 1882 required a certain kind of loudness, a willingness to declare yourself, to push back, to make noise enough to be heard above the wind and the cattle drives and the constant clamor of a town that was still deciding what it wanted to be. Caldwell sat right on the edge of Indian Territory to the south, which made it a crossing point for cattle drives coming up from Texas along the Kishom Trail, and that meant the population of the town swelled and shrank with the seasons, and the permanent residents had all developed the habit of asserting themselves plainly or being overlooked entirely. Elsie was not loud. She had never been loud. Even as a child, she had communicated in a language of careful attention and precise action rather than words, and her father, who had been a quiet man himself and had understood her completely, had called it her great gift. Her mother had died when Elsie was 9, and her father had raised her among books and ledgers and the rhythmic press of the printing machinery, and she had grown up believing that the most important things were usually the things that did not need to be shouted. The women of Caldwell were kind enough to her in the way that women in small towns are kind to newcomers, formally, with a certain reserve, waiting to see what she was made of before they offered anything warmer. Mrs. Patton, the wife of the town's physician, invited her to the ladies' auxiliary meeting in her second week, and then spent the majority of the meeting talking over Elsie's few, careful contributions to the conversation. Clara Finn, who ran the boarding house 2 streets over, told her neighbor within Elsie's earshot that the girl from Missouri was sweet enough but seemed to have nothing to say for herself and would probably not last the year. She lasted. She settled. She learned the rhythms of the town with the same patient attention she gave to everything, and she kept Gerald Holt's books with a precision that began drawing compliments from the ranchers and trail bosses who came in to settle accounts, because they were men who valued accuracy above nearly everything else, and Elsie's figures were never wrong. She had been in Caldwell for 3 months when she first properly noticed Theodore Walker. She had seen him before, of course. A town of Caldwell's size in 1882 did not offer the luxury of invisibility, and Theodore Walker was not, in any case, the kind of man who was easy to miss. He was 28 years old and had been working cattle since he was 16, first on drives up from Texas, and then as a ranch hand for the Brennan family, whose operation sat about 4 miles east of town on good grass with a reliable creek. He was tall and lean in the way that men who spent most of their lives on horseback tended to be, not slight, but with a kind of economical quality to his build, as though every part of him had been shaped by necessity rather than comfort. He had light brown hair that went a shade lighter in the summer sun, eyes the color of a winter sky on a clear day, a pale, serious gray-blue, and a face that was weathered enough to be interesting but not yet so weathered as to be hard. He was known around Caldwell as a reliable man, which was a considerable thing to be said of a cowboy in those years, when reliability was rarer than most other virtues. He paid his debts, kept his word, did not drink to excess, and had a reputation for being exceptionally good with horses in a way that went beyond simple skill into something closer to understanding. The Brennan family trusted him, which meant something, because old Henry Brennan was not a man who trusted easily. Elsie had noted all of this in the gradual, accumulating way she noted everything, filing it away without necessarily attaching any particular significance to it. He came into the dry goods store perhaps once a week for supplies that the ranch needed, and she handled his transactions with the same quiet efficiency she applied to every transaction, and he had always been courteous to her in an uncomplicated, unremarkable way. What changed on that particular afternoon in late June was that she was sitting on the step outside the back door of the store during her midday break, eating the cheese and bread she had brought from her room, and watching a red-tailed hawk that had been circling over the open land at the edge of town for the past 10 minutes. She was completely absorbed in it, tracking the precise geometry of its circles, the way it adjusted its wings in minute degrees to ride the thermal currents, and she did not hear Theodore Walker come around the side of the building until he was almost beside her. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up, unsurprised in manner if not in fact, and they regarded each other for a moment. He looked at her, then followed her gaze up to where the hawk was still turning against the blue Kansas sky, and he stood there watching it with her for what might have been 2 full minutes without saying a word. Then he said, "Red-tailed, see how it's holding that inside wing, means it's found a good column of air." "Yes," she said, "I noticed that." He glanced at her then, something shifting in his expression that she could not quite name. He touched the brim of his hat and went around to the front of the store. It was not a remarkable exchange by any standard. But Elsie found herself thinking about it that evening, sitting at her small desk in her room above the store with the window open to let in the cooler air, and she realized that she was thinking about it because it had felt, in some quiet way that she struggled to articulate even to herself, like being seen. July came in hot and relentless the way Kansas Julys always did, and the cattle drives through Caldwell brought the usual complications, dust and noise, and the swelling of the saloon's business, and the occasional dispute that spilled out into the main street. Elsie kept to her routines and stayed mostly out of the way of the trail crews, and Gerald Holt had long since stopped worrying about whether she could handle frontier life and started worrying instead about what he would do if she ever decided to leave. Theodore Walker came into the store on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July when the heat was so thick that the air felt like something you had to push through, and he bought flour and salt and a length of rope and 2 tins of lamp oil, and while Elsie was writing up the ticket he said, without particular preamble, I heard what Clara Finn said about you." Elsie did not look up from the ledger. "Clara Finn says a great many things." "She says you won't last." He paused. "I don't think she's right." Elsie set down her pen and looked at him directly. "What makes you say that?" He considered the question with the seriousness she had begun to notice he gave to most things. "You watch everything. You don't waste a word. Out here, that's worth more than people give it credit for." She studied him for a moment. "Most people here seem to think the opposite." "Most people here are wrong about a good number of things," he said, without any particular heat to it, just as a plain statement of fact. He picked up his supplies and put his hat back on and went to the door, and then he paused with his hand on the frame and said, "There's a pair of barn owls nesting in the old cottonwood by the creek, east side of town, if you're ever out that way in the evening." Then he left. Elsie stood at the counter for a long moment after the door swung shut, and she felt something stir in her chest that was unfamiliar and interesting and not at all unpleasant. She went to see the barn owls that Friday evening, walking the half-mile to the creek in the cooling air after the store closed, and she found the cottonwood easily enough and sat down at the base of it with her back against the bark and waited. And after 20 minutes or so the two owls came in, white and ghost-silent in the fading light, and she sat very still and watched them settle and preen and exchange the quiet sounds they made to each other. And it was one of the loveliest things she had seen since leaving St. Louis. She did not know that Theodore Walker had come to check that she had found the right tree, standing a distance off with his hat in his hand, watching her watch the owls. He left before she turned around, and he rode back to the Brennan Ranch with something he did not quite have words for sitting warm and unfamiliar in his chest. The following week brought a trial of a different kind. A man named Doyle Marsh, who was a trail boss of the rougher variety, loud, given to drink, and not much inclined toward courtesy, came into the dry goods store with two of his hands and began demanding a credit account that Gerald Holt had already refused him once on account of an unpaid balance from the previous season. Gerald was not in the store. He had gone to see Dr. Patton about a tooth that had been troubling him, and Elsie was alone behind the counter. Marsh was the kind of man who assumed that quiet people were afraid people, and he leaned on the counter and spoke to Elsie in a way that was designed to intimidate, making it clear that he expected her to simply open the credit book and give him what he wanted because surely she would not want any trouble. Elsie looked at him for a moment, and then she opened the ledger to the page that showed his account, turned it around so he could read it himself, and said in a voice that was perfectly level and completely clear, "Mr. Holt has written it here. No credit extended until the outstanding balance is settled. You owe $14.30 from last October. When that is paid, you are welcome to establish a new account." Marsh put both hands flat on the counter and leaned forward. "Now listen here, girl." "I have listened," Elsie said. "The balance is $14.30. The ledger does not change because you lean on the counter." There was a long, charged silence. One of Marsh's hands smothered a sound that might have been a laugh. Marsh pushed back, his face dark with irritation, and he left without his supplies and without having gotten what he came for. And Elsie wrote down the time and nature of the exchange in the small notebook she kept for unusual occurrences, in case Gerald Holt needed the record. Theodore Walker heard about the incident before the end of the day. Small towns in 1882 moved news the way wind moved seeds, and he heard it from Jim Brennan, Henry's youngest son, who had heard it from the man at the livery stable, who had heard it directly from one of Marsh's own trail hands, who had apparently found the whole thing highly entertaining. Theodore said very little in response, but something settled in him more firmly than it had before. August arrived with a thunderstorm that knocked down part of the fence on the eastern edge of the Brennan property, and Theodore spent 4 days doing the repair work with 2 other hands, and during that time, he came to think very clearly and deliberately about Elsie Kingsley in a way he had previously only been doing around the edges. He was not a man who rushed at things. He was not a man who confused feeling something with knowing what to do about it. But he had also been on the frontier long enough to know that life did not hold itself still and wait for men to gather their courage. And by the time the fence was mended, he had decided that he was going to call on her properly. He arrived at the dry goods store on a Saturday morning when he knew Gerald Holt would be present, because he intended to do this correctly, and he asked Mr. Holt, with the directness of a man who is uncomfortable with anything other than plainness, whether he might have permission to call on Miss Kingsley. Gerald Holt, who had by this point a great deal of respect for Elsie, and also a practical interest in her happiness since happy employees were reliable employees, said that the question was better put to Miss Kingsley herself, and went into the back to tell her Theodore Walker was asking to speak with her. Elsie came out from behind the curtain that separated the back storage area from the shop floor, and she looked at Theodore, who was standing with his hat in both hands in the particular way that men on the frontier held their hats when they were trying to be serious and respectful, and something in her chest did the same unfamiliar, warm thing it had been doing with increasing frequency lately. "I would like to call on you," Theodore said, "properly, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment with those deliberate hazel eyes, and then she said, "Sunday afternoons are generally free." "Sunday afternoon, then," he said. He put his hat back on, bought the items he actually needed from the store. He had written a list, and left. Gerald Holt appeared in the doorway of the back room and looked at Elsie with an expression she chose not to acknowledge. "Not a word, Mr. Holt," she said, and went back to the ledger. He had the good sense to say nothing, though she could hear him smiling from the other side of the curtain. The first Sunday call was conducted with the proper formality of the era. They sat in the small parlor that served the tenants of the store's upper floor, with the door to the hallway appropriately open, and they talked for an hour and a half about things that were, on the surface, not particularly romantic: the red-tailed hawk populations of the Kansas plains, the approach of the fall cattle drives, the differences between the soil conditions east and west of town, the current state of the Brennan Ranch's livestock. But Elsie had lived long enough in the world of careful communication to know that what was being said was only part of what was happening in a conversation. And what was happening in the conversation was that two people were learning the shape of each other's minds, and she found Theodore's mind to be a more interesting and surprising landscape than she had entirely expected. He read when he could, which was not often, but he read seriously. Not the dime novels that were so popular among younger cowboys, but actual books, history mostly, and some natural philosophy. And he had opinions about what he read that he offered carefully, and with the particular tentativeness of a man who was not sure his opinions were welcome in most company. With Elsie, they were welcome. She challenged two of them directly, and with a precision that startled him into a short silence, and then into a genuine and open laugh that transformed his face into something quite wonderful, and she thought that she would very much like to make him laugh like that again. When he left that first Sunday, he paused on the step and said, "I enjoyed that more than I expected to." "That's possibly a compliment," she said. "It's absolutely a compliment," he said. "I just said it badly." "You said it honestly," she replied. "That's better." He smiled at her, and it was the kind of smile that arrived slowly and stayed, and she watched him walk to his horse and mount up and ride out toward the Brennan Ranch, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before going back inside. The Sunday calls continued through August and into September, and the formality of them loosened gradually in the natural way of such things, and they began to take walks together in the cooler evening air after the official call had concluded, with Caldwell's main street quiet around them, and the enormous Kansas sky going gold, and then pink, and then the deep purple blue that Elsie had discovered was one of the most beautiful things about this flat and treeless landscape. The sky was everything out here, because there was nothing to obstruct it, and the sunsets went on forever in every direction. Theodore taught her to identify the calls of birds she had not grown up knowing, and she in turn spent an afternoon showing him the system she had developed for Gerald Holt's accounts, which was more sophisticated than anything he had seen applied to a frontier business. And he sat across the desk from her and watched her explain it with a focused attention that she found deeply gratifying, because he was actually listening, actually following her thinking. And when she finished, he had one genuinely incisive question that improved the system, and she told him so directly. And he looked so pleased that she had to look back down at the ledger to keep her expression from revealing too much. October brought the fall drives and the busy season at the store, and Elsie worked long hours and sometimes did not see Theodore for a full week, and she noticed the absence of him the way you notice when a sound that has become part of your daily environment suddenly stops. She wrote to her friend Marta back in St. Louis, the only real friend she had kept from her previous life, and she described Theodore Walker carefully and precisely, the way she always described things, and Marta wrote back that from the description it sounded very much like Elsie was in love, and would she please confirm or deny this because Marta could not bear the suspense. Elsie read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the cedar trunk that had belonged to her mother. She did not write a reply for 3 days because she was thinking about Marta's question with the same serious attention she gave to important questions. On the 3rd day she wrote back, "I believe you may be right, and I find I am not at all alarmed by it, which is itself informative." The incident that changed things between them in a definitive and irreversible way happened on the 2nd Saturday of October, which was a market day, and therefore the busiest day of the week for the dry goods store. Elsie was behind the counter managing 3 customers at once in her calm, efficient manner when she heard raised voices outside, and through the glass of the front window she could see that Doyle Marsh, who had apparently returned to Caldwell with a new drive, was in the middle of the main street, engaged in an argument with a younger cowboy she did not know. And the argument had the particular quality of escalation that meant it was going to become something worse before it became something better. She was not alarmed by this in itself. Disputes between trail hands were not uncommon, and the town marshal, a man named Creed, generally handled them adequately. But she could also see that Marshal Creed was not on the street, and that the argument was tipping rapidly past argument into something physical, and that several of Marsh's other hands were drifting in from the edges in a way that suggested the younger cowboy was not going to come out of this well. What happened next was that Theodore Walker came around the corner from the direction of the livery stable at a measured, deliberate walk, and he placed himself between Marsh and the younger man with no particular hurry and no visible anxiety, and he said something to Marsh in a voice too low for Elsie to hear through the window glass. And whatever he said, combined with whatever Marsh saw in Theodore's face when he said it, produced a long and charged pause, and then a grudging, muttered response from Marsh. And the situation deflated in the way that certain situations deflate when someone with genuine calm refuses to be rattled. Theodore said something to the younger cowboy, who nodded and moved off. He said something else to Marsh, who took it with poor grace but took it. And then he looked through the window of the dry goods store and met Elsie's eyes, and she did not look away, and he held her gaze for a moment before turning to walk back toward the livery. She finished with her customers. She closed the store for the midday break and walked to the livery stable, which was not something she had done before, and she found Theodore around the back of it, checking the hoof of a dun-colored horse with the absorbed concentration he brought to all things practical. "You did not have to do that," she said. He set the horse's foot down and straightened. Marsh was going to hurt that boy, 3 against 1. "I know," she said. "I was watching." She paused. "I was also watching when Marsh came into the store in July." He looked at her steadily. "I heard about that. Then you know I am capable of managing situations on my own." "I know," he said. "I never thought otherwise." She looked at him. "Then why did you step in just now? Not because you thought the other man incapable." "Because it was wrong," Theodore said simply. 3 against 1 is wrong, and Marsh is a bully, and sometimes wrong things need someone to stand in front of them. It wasn't about capability. Elsie considered this for a moment. That's a very good answer. It's just the true one, he said. She stood for another moment, and then she said something she had not planned to say and would not have said to anyone else in Caldwell. I am not quiet because I have nothing to say, Theodore. I am quiet because I am listening to everything, and most things do not require a verbal response. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when something she said had reached somewhere in him that he did not usually let things reach. I know that, he said quietly. I've known that since the first week you were here. She looked at him for a moment longer. All right, she said, and walked back to the store. But she was smiling all the way back, and she did not particularly try to hide it, because it was a Saturday and the main street was loud with market day business, and no one was paying close enough attention to notice. The following Sunday, he did not sit in the parlor. He brought his horse and a second, gentler mare that belonged to the Brennan Ranch and that he had obtained permission to borrow, and he asked if she had ever ridden out onto the open plains east of town. She had not. She had not ridden much at all, having spent her life in St. Louis, and she told him so directly. He taught her, with the same patient thoroughness he applied to horses, starting with the basics of the saddle and the signals and the balance. And she was a quick learner because she paid attention and did not panic when the mare moved unexpectedly beneath her. And within an hour they were moving at a gentle walk out through the golden grass east of town, and the horizon opened up in every direction until it felt like being at the center of the world. She stopped the mare on a low rise and looked at it, all of it, the grass moving in the October wind like a slow sea, the sky enormous above them, the thin line of the creek to the north marked by the cottonwoods going yellow, the town small and compact behind them, smoke rising from its chimneys in the cool air. Oh, she said softly, just that. Theodore pulled up beside her and watched her face. I understand now, she said, why people come here. I understood it intellectually before, but I did not feel it until now. What do you feel? He asked. She thought about it. Large, she said, and also very small, both at the same time. That's exactly it, he said, and his voice had something in it that she recognized as the tone of a person who has been trying to explain something for a long time and has just heard someone else explain it perfectly. They sat on that rise for a long time, until the sun was getting low and the shadow of the grass stretched long and blue beside them, and they talked about her father, who she rarely spoke of, and about Theodore's family in Virginia. He had 2 brothers still there and a mother who wrote letters with the devoted regularity of a woman who had chosen to let her children go into the world, but intended to maintain her presence in it. And about the nature of the plains and what it meant to build something out here on this still raw edge of American life. Do you think you will stay? He asked her, not casually. Yes, she said. She looked at him. Do you? I've been thinking, he said carefully, about land. Henry Brennan has offered me a section on the north end of his property at a fair price. Good grass, good water. I've been working toward having enough saved for the deposit. Elsie looked at him with the clear attention that he had learned meant she understood the full weight of what was being said, not just the surface of it. That would be a significant undertaking, she said. Yes, he agreed. One that would benefit from practical partnership. He looked at her. That is not how I would have put it, he said, and his voice was warm in a way that made her breath catch slightly. But yes. The evening had gone deep blue around them, and they were closer together than propriety strictly required, and neither of them moved away. Theodore, she said. Elsie, he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something he had been holding carefully for a long time. I think, she said, that you should speak plainly if you have something to say. He turned to look at her fully in the dying light, his pale blue-gray eyes serious and warm and completely honest. I love you, he said. I think I have for a while now, and I'm not a man who generally takes this long to say something I know to be true, but I wanted to be sure I was saying it right. I don't just mean the feeling of it. I mean that I want to know every quiet corner of how your mind works, and I want you to be there in the morning. And I want to hear what you say about the hawk and the owl and every ledger you ever keep. And I want to be the person you choose to use your words on, because I know that means something when you do." He paused. "That's what I mean." The wind moved through the grass around them with a soft, continuous sound. "That is," Elsie said, "the most I have heard you say at one time. I can go back to fewer words if you preferred it." "No," she said. "No, I think those were exactly the right number." She looked at him steadily, and the expression on her face was not one she had ever shown to anyone else in Caldwell, and perhaps not to many people anywhere. "I love you too, Theodore. I have been working up to saying it for weeks, because I wanted to be certain I meant it the full way and not just the convenient way. I mean it the full way." He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, his fingers warm and careful around hers, and they sat like that in the blue dusk on the open plains of Kansas, and it felt to both of them like an arrival rather than a beginning, not the start of something new, but the recognition of something that had been true for some time already. They rode back to town slowly, not saying much, because there was not much that needed to be said. And when he helped her down from the mare in front of the store and held her hand a moment longer than was necessary, she looked up at him in the lamplight from the window, and he bent his head and kissed her gently and carefully. And she put her free hand against his chest and felt the solid, steady beating of his heart, and it felt like something she wanted to go on hearing for a very long time. He proposed to her on the 1st of November, in the dry goods store during business hours, because he said he had not been able to think of a single reason to wait any longer, and he did it correctly. He had written to her aunt in St. Louis, her mother's sister, who was her nearest living relative, and obtained that lady's blessing. And he presented it to her with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and that his mother had sent west with his older brother 2 years ago, with the message that it should go to whoever in the family needed it first. The ring was a small gold band with a single garnet, dark red and warm-colored, and when Theodore put it on her finger she looked at it for a long moment with an expression of careful wonder. "Yes," she said, before he had technically completed the question, which made him laugh. "I was going to say more," he said. "You can say the rest if you like," she told him, and he did, and it was beautiful, and she listened to every word. Gerald Holt, who had been attempting and failing to be subtle about listening from behind the curtain, knocked something over in his enthusiasm upon hearing her answer, and both of them looked at the curtain, and Elsie said calmly, "You can come out, Mr. Holt," and he emerged looking thoroughly delighted and not remotely apologetic, and he shook Theodore's hand vigorously, and told Elsie she had better not leave him in the lurch with the accounts, at which point she told him that they had not discussed where they would be living, and he need not panic yet. They were married in the spring of 1883, on the 22nd of April, which was a day of extraordinary Kansas weather, clear in the morning, and then dramatically cloudy, and then clear again by the afternoon, with a warm wind that smelled of new grass and distant rain. The ceremony was performed by the Methodist minister in the small white church at the end of Caldwell's Main Street, and attended by most of the town, because Theodore Walker was well liked, and because Elsie Kingsley, who had arrived quiet and unremarked upon 11 months earlier, had quietly and without fanfare become someone that Caldwell was proud to claim. Clara Finn was there, and she had the grace to look somewhat sheepish. Henry Brennan and his wife sat in the front pew, and Henry Brennan cried, which surprised everyone including himself, "Mrs. Patton brought a cake that was very nearly the most elaborate thing Caldwell had seen, and considered it a personal contribution to the occasion. Elsie wore a dress she had made herself from ivory cotton with small blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she had her hair down in waves that she rarely wore loose, and she walked up the aisle with her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes on Theodore, who was standing at the front of the church with an expression of such naked, uncomplicated joy on his face that two women in the back pew felt their eyes fill without knowing exactly why. When the minister asked if she took this man, she said yes with the same clear, quiet certainty she gave to everything she meant completely. The land deal with Henry Brennan was completed in May of 1883. Theodore had been working and saving for 3 years by that point, and the price was fair as Henry had promised, and with Elsie's careful management of the account records. She had done the calculations herself and negotiated one clause of the agreement that saved them $40 over the term. They took possession of the north section, which was 160 acres of good grass with the creek running along the eastern edge, and a view to the north that went on until the sky caught it. The house they built that summer was not large. It was a good solid structure of lumber and stone, 2 rooms and a loft to start, with a front window that Elsie had specifically insisted upon because she wanted the light in the morning, and a stone fireplace that took Theodore and Jim Brennan and 2 other men 2 full weeks to complete properly, and that would prove, through many subsequent winters, to have been entirely worth the effort. She planted a kitchen garden against the south wall and put up a window box for herbs, and she brought her cedar trunk and set it at the foot of the bed that Theodore had made himself from the lumber left over from the house building. And when it was all done, they stood in the doorway together in the evening light and looked at what they had made. "It's ours," Theodore said. "Yes," Elsie said, and she said it the way she said the things she meant the most, quietly and completely. Their first full year on the land was not easy, and was not supposed to be. Ranching in Kansas in the 1880s was a business of perpetual problem-solving. Weather, disease, market prices, land disputes, water rights, and they met each problem as it arrived, usually with Theodore's practical knowledge and physical capability, and Elsie's analysis and careful thinking working together in a combination that proved, over time, to be remarkably effective. She kept the ranch accounts with the same precision she had brought to Gerald Holt's business, and she developed relationships with the buyers and suppliers that were based on her reputation for absolute accuracy and good faith. And within 2 seasons, she had negotiated terms for their small but growing herd that several larger operations in the county envied. She also continued for a time to help Gerald Holt with his books on a partial basis. Riding into town twice a week on the mare, Theodore had purchased for her a bright bay who she had named simply Red, which Theodore had pointed out was not particularly imaginative, and she had agreed and kept the name anyway. And she used those trips to maintain the relationships she had built in town, which benefited them both in ways that were practical as well as personal. The land itself was one of the ongoing miracles of Elsie's new life. She had not expected to love it the way she did. She had come west for practical reasons and had expected to find it livable, and had instead found it something close to transcendent, in the particular way that enormous, flat, sky-dominated landscapes are transcendent to the people who choose to give themselves to them. She walked the edges of their property in the early mornings when the light was long and gold and the dew still held, and she learned every fold of the land, every reliable patch of good grass, the place where the creek bent and deepened enough to hold fish, the cottonwood stand on the eastern fence that the owls favored in autumn. Theodore watched her learn the land and felt something in him that was deeper than pride and quieter than love, though it was both of those things too. It was the satisfaction of rightness, of 2 things that belong together finally being in proximity to each other. Their first real crisis came in the October of 1883, with a cattle sickness that moved through 3 properties in the county, and took 7 of their animals before Theodore and old Henry Brennan, who came over immediately when he heard, identified the source as a stretch of water that had gone bad from a dead animal upstream. They lost 7 cattle, and the financial setback was significant, and Elsie sat at the table the evening after the last of the sick animals was put down and did the revised figures 3 times, working through the numbers in careful silence while Theodore sat across from her with his coffee and watched her work. "We can carry it," she said finally. "We'll have to adjust the breeding plan for next year, and I want to renegotiate the supply account with Hanson's before spring. But we can carry it." Theodore nodded. "I know," he said. "I was waiting to see what you thought." She looked up at him. "You already knew the figures." "I knew some of them," he said. "You know all of them." She put down her pen and looked at him with an expression that was warm and direct and completely honest. "This is going to be harder than we thought, Theodore. Not just this setback, all of it, building this." "Yes," he said simply. "Are you frightened?" He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything she asked him. "Not with you doing the figures," he said. "No." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, and it was the particular Elsie Kingsley smile that only Theodore ever saw, not the composed, polite expression she offered to the world, but the real one, warm and a little rueful and completely unguarded. "You always say exactly the right thing," she told him. "I say the true thing," he said. "Sometimes it's the same." She picked up her pen and went back to the figures, and he went back to his coffee, and outside the wind moved through the grass in the dark, and inside the fireplace sent its light against the stone walls of the room they had built, and it was enough. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard in the way that Kansas winters could be hard, sustained, and relentless, with cold that went on past the point where you stopped marveling at it and simply endured it. They were adequately provisioned, because Elsie had planned for a hard winter on the basis of the accounts from the previous 2 years, and the advice of people who had been on the plains longer, and the animals came through reasonably well, because Theodore spent long days in bitter cold, keeping them sheltered and watered. But the isolation of the winter months was something Elsie had not entirely prepared for, and she worked through it by writing extensively in the journals she had kept since childhood, detailed, observational records of the land and the seasons and the daily life of the ranch, and by reading the books that Theodore had accumulated over the years, and by conducting what she privately thought of as a deep and patient study of her husband. He was, she had come to understand, one of the more interesting people she had ever known, and she had grown up in a print shop in St. Louis that sent her father's papers all over the city, which meant she had read widely and had met a great variety of people through the medium of those pages. Theodore was interesting not in the way that loud, dramatic people are interesting. He was not that, but in the way that a landscape is interesting, with more layers the closer you looked, and with a fundamental stability that was not the same as simplicity. He was also, she had discovered, quietly funny in a very dry way that he deployed so sparingly that it caught her off guard every time, and she had come to believe that his comedy was intentional, that he found her reactions amusing in themselves and timed his remarks accordingly, and this delighted her in a way she could not fully explain. By February, she had admitted to herself that being snowed in with Theodore Walker was one of the most pleasurable experiences of her adult life, and this seemed to her a very good sign for the future. Spring came with the particular violence of Kansas springs, sudden, dramatic smelling of mud and new grass, and rain that fell in genuine sheets rather than the polite drizzles of Missouri. The creek flooded its banks by 4 feet, and Theodore spent 2 days repairing the eastern fence line, and Elsie managed the kitchen garden against the onslaught of the rain by building small drainage channels with a methodical precision that made Theodore, watching her from the doorway, feel such a surge of affection that he had to look away for a moment. They had not spoken of children specifically, though it was understood between them in the way that certain things were understood as part of the life they were building, waiting for the moment that was right. The right moment announced itself quietly in the early summer of 1884, and Elsie told Theodore on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the front step watching the sunset go on in its enormous, unhurried Kansas way, and she told him the same way she told him everything important, directly and quietly and completely. He did not say anything for what felt like a long time. Then he took her hand and held it against his chest, and she felt his heart beating fast beneath her palm. "Theodore," she said. "I'm trying," he said, "to find words that are adequate. I don't think there are any." "That's all right," she said. "I can see your face." He turned, and she saw everything she needed to on it, the joy and the fear and the fierce, encompassing love of a man who understood what was being added to his life and took it with his whole self. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the middle of a snowstorm that had Dr. Patton arriving at the ranch in conditions that made everyone involved briefly anxious. But Dr. Patton was a competent man and had delivered babies in worse circumstances, and the boy was born sound and healthy, and with a remarkable amount of dark hair and eyes that were, in the early weeks, indeterminate but would eventually settle into his father's pale gray-blue. They named him James Arthur Walker, James for Henry Brennan's youngest son, who had been a consistent friend to both of them, and Arthur for Elsie's father, whose print shop in St. Louis had given her everything she was, and who deserved to be carried forward into the new life his daughter had built. Theodore held his son for the first time with the same deliberate, careful quality he brought to all things that mattered, and Elsie, exhausted but clear-eyed and present in the way she always was, watched him from the bed and felt something complete itself in her chest that she had not known was waiting to be completed. "He's very quiet," Theodore said, looking down at the baby, who had indeed gone silent and was looking up at his father with a concentrated attention that was immediately and obviously Elsie's. "He's listening," Elsie said, "to everything." Theodore looked up at her and smiled, and it was the slow, staying smile she had loved from the beginning. "That's a very good sign," he said. James Arthur Walker was, as it turned out, a quiet child in the specific way his mother was quiet, not shy, not withdrawn, but intensely observant, with a stillness about him that adults found either unsettling or deeply compelling depending on their own dispositions. He was a healthy, sturdy boy who learned to walk with the single-minded determination of a person who has identified an objective and is not interested in detours, and who could sit for extraordinary stretches of time watching the animals in the yard, or the clouds moving over the prairie, or his mother writing in her journal, absorbing everything with those pale, serious eyes. The ranch grew in those years. Theodore had been right about the north section. The grass was good and the water was reliable, and the Brennan land to the south meant that their eastern and southern boundaries were in good hands, which mattered enormously in a landscape where the difference between cooperative neighbors and hostile ones could be the difference between a viable operation and a disaster. They added to the herd carefully, never overextending, and Elsie's management of the accounts meant they always knew exactly where they stood and were never surprised by a shortfall. The town of Caldwell grew around them too, changing in the way that Kansas towns were changing in the mid-1880s, as the wildest years of the cattle drives began to settle into something more established, more structured. The influx of settlers under the Homestead Act was changing the landscape, and the debates between cattlemen and the incoming farming families were genuine and sometimes fierce, because they represented two fundamentally incompatible ideas about what the land should be used for. Theodore navigated these disputes with his characteristic steadiness, maintaining good relations with both sides, because he understood from his own experience that the future would require accommodation rather than conflict, and because Elsie's analysis of the economic situations involved was generally more accurate than anyone else's in the county. She had also, by 1886, become something of an unofficial institution in Caldwell. She was not loud about it. She never was, but she had a reputation for honest dealing and sound thinking that had spread well beyond Gerald Holt's store, and she was regularly consulted by ranching families and small business owners alike about financial questions and account management, and she handled these consultations with the same quiet thoroughness she gave to everything. It was Theodore who told her, one evening, that people in Caldwell were talking about her, and she looked at him with mild inquiry, and he said that they were saying she was the best head for figures in the county, and she said that was probably accurate. "That is," he said, "exactly the kind of thing I love about you. The accuracy, the complete absence of false modesty," he said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the one she gave freely in private, and he thought, as he always did, that it was one of the most beautiful sounds he knew. In the spring of 1887, Elsie discovered she was expecting their second child. James was 2 years old by then, steady on his feet and already displaying a disconcerting tendency to simply appear in rooms without having been heard to enter, which Theodore said was going to be both a remarkable skill and a considerable problem as the boy got older. The second pregnancy was harder than the first in its early months. She was more tired, and she had the ranch accounts and a growing consultation business and a 2-year-old. And there were weeks in April and May where she simply had to put certain things down and rest, which went against a very fundamental part of her nature. Theodore managed it with the same steady, practical care he managed all of it. He took on more of the domestic work without being asked, cooked with a simple competence that she had never known him to advertise but that proved reliable, and sat with James in the evenings so she could sleep. She noticed all of it. She always noticed everything. "You do not have to take on so much," she told him one evening in May. "I know," he said. "I want to, because you love me." "Because I love you," he agreed in the same plain way he said everything. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Theodore," she said, "I want you to know that I am happy, not managing, not making the best of it, genuinely, fully happy." He turned his hand over and held hers. "So am I," he said. "Every morning I wake up in this house on this land with you and James, and I think, there is nothing I am missing, there is nothing more I need." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. "You have said more beautiful things," she told him, "than any quiet man I have ever heard of." "I learned it from a woman who showed me that words matter when they're meant," he said. She had to look away for a moment because she felt her eyes fill, and she was not generally a person who cried easily. She cleared her throat and picked up her pen, and he went back to his coffee, and outside the evening wind moved through the grass. Their second child was born in November of 1887. A girl this time, healthy and strong and immediately, clearly loud in a way that James had never been, and that announced itself with a vigor that made Dr. Patton chuckle and Theodore look both delighted and slightly alarmed. They named her Ruth Eleanor Walker Ruth for Theodore's mother, who had never stopped writing, and who had been sending letters of increasing enthusiasm as the family grew, and Eleanor for no one in particular except that it was a name Elsie had always loved, and that seemed, when applied to this small, vigorous person, to fit her completely. Ruth Walker was, from the beginning, emphatically and cheerfully not quiet. She had opinions and she expressed them. She had preferences and she pursued them. She had a laugh that filled the entire house and a cry of similar dimensions. And she moved through the world at a pace and volume that was the exact opposite of her brother's contained stillness. And Theodore and Elsie adored her with the same wholehearted, uncomplicated love they gave to James, and marveled privately at how two people could produce children so thoroughly different and so thoroughly themselves. James, for his part, regarded his sister with the quiet, concentrated attention he gave to all new phenomena, and then, after 2 weeks of observation, demonstrated that his assessment was favorable by handing her his most valued possession, a smooth gray stone he had found by the creek that he carried everywhere. And from that point forward the bond between them was established and would prove entirely durable. Caldwell continued to change and evolve through the late 1880s. The lawlessness that had characterized the height of the cattle drive years was diminishing, as the drives themselves began to slow. The expansion of the railroad network was changing the routes and the economics of the beef trade, and the town was adjusting to a different identity, one less defined by the transit trade and more by the permanent ranching and farming community that had established itself around it. This was, on balance, a good thing for Theodore and Elsie Walker, whose operation was built on exactly the kind of sustainable permanence that the new era favored. Theodore was offered the position of county commissioner in 1888 and declined it on the grounds that he was a rancher and not a politician. And Elsie, when he told her he had declined, said she thought he had made the right decision for the wrong reason, because the real reason was not that he was unqualified but that he preferred direct action to governance. He looked at her for a moment and then said that she was probably right. She said she knew she was. Henry Brennan died in the winter of 1889, peacefully in his sleep, which was the death he had always said he wanted, and which everyone who knew him agreed he had more than earned. Theodore was one of the pallbearers, and Elsie stood beside him at the graveside in the cold January air and held his hand. And when they got home, she made hot coffee and they sat at the table and talked about Henry for an hour. His specific generosities and his particular stubbornness, and the way he had cried at their wedding and never once acknowledged it. And it was the kind of talking that honoring someone properly requires. The Brennan land passed to Henry's elder son, Robert, who was a competent rancher and a decent neighbor, and the good relationship between the properties continued under his stewardship. The children grew in the particular accelerating way of children, each year folding into the next with a speed that Theodore found occasionally vertiginous, and Elsie tracked carefully in the journals she had kept continuously since arriving in Kansas. James was quiet and precise and fascinated by the natural world, the birds especially, which he had learned from both his parents, and by the time he was 7 he could identify the calls of 30 different species and had begun, on his own initiative and without being taught, to keep a small journal of his own observations, written in a careful, plain hand. Ruth was vigorous and social, and had more friends than could comfortably fit in the house at once, and she talked with the ease of someone for whom words cost nothing and spent freely, and she had her father's steadiness in a noisier package. Elsie watched them both with the deep, attentive love of a mother who has known what it is to be misread, and who was determined that her children would always know themselves understood. She talked to James the way her father had talked to her, seriously, specifically, treating his observations as the real things they were. She talked to Ruth the way Ruth needed to be talked to, with energy and directness, and the willingness to keep up. She understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who had spent her whole life navigating a world that valued loudness, that the best thing she could do for her children was to see them clearly. Theodore did the same, with the unself-conscious ease of a man who did not distinguish between the kinds of love he gave. He taught James the land and the animals with patient thoroughness, and he taught Ruth with equal patience, and without any assumption that she wanted different things because she was a girl, which was not universally the attitude of men in 1880s Kansas, and which Elsie noticed and was grateful for every single time she observed it. In the summer of 1890, when James was 5 and Ruth was nearly 3, they had a visitor. Theodore's mother, Ruth Walker Sr., who came west from Virginia for the first time in her life at the age of 61, traveling on the railroad that had extended considerably since Theodore had first come to Kansas, and arriving at the Caldwell station with 2 large trunks and the kind of composed, upright bearing that immediately told Elsie exactly where Theodore had gotten his particular quality of stillness. They recognized each other instantly, Elsie and Theodore's mother, in the way that people with similar fundamental natures recognize each other, with a calm, mutual assessment that bypassed pleasantry and went directly to substance. Ruth Walker Sr. was a woman of few words who had clearly raised her youngest son to be the same, and she looked at Elsie for a long moment upon their first meeting and then said, "Theodore wrote that you have a good head for figures and that you are the most sensible person he has met. From what I can see in 5 minutes, he understated it." Elsie said, "He understates most things. It is one of his better qualities." Ruth Walker Sr. smiled slowly, in exactly the way her son smiled. "Yes," she said, "I raised him to do that." The visit lasted 3 weeks and was one of the best 3 weeks of that year. Theodore's mother played with the children with an unself-conscious delight that no one who had only seen her formal bearing would have predicted. And she sat with Elsie in the evenings after the children were in bed, and they talked about Theodore, about the land, about the journey west and what it meant, about the ways in which the country was changing, and what those changes would mean for people like them who had staked their lives on a particular piece of it. On her last evening before the return journey, Ruth Walker Sr. sat with both of them on the front step in the warm summer air and said, in the direct way of the whole family, "I worried about him, you know, when he left Virginia. He was always the quiet one, and I was afraid the world would not know what to do with quiet people." "The world generally doesn't," Elsie said. "But you did," Ruth said. "No," Elsie said. "He did with me. That's the thing we do for each other." Theodore took her hand in the dark, and his mother looked at them both and nodded once, the nod of a woman who has been given an answer she was looking for, and they sat together in the warm Kansas night and said nothing more for a while, because nothing more needed to be said. The years of the early 1890s brought what everyone in the region had feared, the drought cycles that plagued the Great Plains with a regularity and severity that no amount of planning entirely mitigated. The summer of 1890 was dry, and 1891 was worse, and the conversations at every ranch and farm in the county were about water and grass and how long they could sustain their herds on reserves that were shrinking faster than the rain was replenishing them. Theodore and Elsie had prepared for this, because Elsie had read everything she could find about the weather cycles of the Kansas plains since their first year on the land, and she had looked at the accounts from the decade before they arrived and seen the pattern. And she had insisted, over several years, on building their financial reserves to a level that could carry them through 2 bad seasons if necessary, and on maintaining a herd size that the land could sustain in dry years rather than the land at its best. This was not easy. It required saying no to opportunities that looked good in good years, and that Theodore, with his cattleman's instinct for building the herd, had sometimes found difficult to refuse. But Elsie's figures were never wrong, and they had both learned to trust that. And so when the dry years came, they were better positioned than many of their neighbors. They helped where they could. Elsie opened her account books to the Henriksen family, whose operation 3 miles to the north was struggling, and worked through their finances with them and found adjustments that bought them time. Theodore worked with 2 other ranching families on shared water access from the creek, negotiating arrangements that kept everyone viable through the worst of it. It was the kind of frontier mutual aid that the West ran on in its better moments, the recognition that the land was hard enough without neighbors making it harder for each other. There were families who did not make it. There were farms that went back to the bank and people who moved on, and this was painful to witness, and Elsie recorded all of it in her journals, because she believed that the honest record of a time and place was a thing of value even when the record was hard. Theodore sat with men who were leaving, and said his goodbyes with the particular gravity of a person who understands that what is being lost is not just a piece of land, but the accumulated investment of someone's entire life. By the summer of 1892, the rains came back with something approaching the remorse of long absence, and the land greened up with a speed that felt almost apologetic, and the ranches that had survived began the business of rebuilding what the dry years had reduced. The Walker Ranch came through it intact, which was not nothing. Theodore, surveying the property at the end of that first good summer, said quietly that Elsie had saved them, and she said no, they had saved each other, and they had a brief and characteristic disagreement about this before arriving at the mutual acknowledgement that they were probably both right. James Walker, who was 7 in 1892, spent that summer following his father around the ranch with the absorbed attention of a child who has decided on his vocation, and Theodore recognized it and treated it seriously, teaching the boy with the patience and care that his own teachers had rarely given him. Ruth, who was 4, had also decided on her vocation, which was apparently to befriend every person and animal within a 5-mile radius, and she pursued it with her customary energy. Elsie, watching her son and her daughter and her husband on a summer evening from the kitchen doorway, felt the particular, complete happiness of a person who has built the exact life they wanted, not the life they were told to want but the real one, the one that fit the shape of who they actually were. She had been dismissed as too quiet for frontier life. She had heard it said directly, and she had heard it implied, and she had seen it in the eyes of people who looked at her and found her wanting, who expected the West to demand a kind of loudness she had never possessed and never intended to produce. And she had stayed, and she had worked, and she had built, and she had loved this man who had seen her silence for what it was, not absence, not weakness, not the failure to be something, but a completely different and entirely valid way of being present in the world. That evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet with the particular full quiet of a late summer night on the plains, Elsie sat at the kitchen table with her journal open and her pen in her hand, and Theodore came and sat across from her with his coffee, as he had done 1,000 evenings, and he said nothing for a while and she wrote nothing for a while, and they were simply there together in the lamplight. Then he said, "What are you thinking?" She looked up. "That I am grateful," she said. "That I am more grateful than I know how to write, and I have been trying to write it for 9 years. He looked at her steadily. "Then stop trying to write it and just say it." "I just did," she said. "Say more," he told her, and it was the gentlest possible request, and she knew he meant it. She put down her pen. "I am grateful for this land and this house and these children and this life. I am grateful that I got on that stagecoach in St. Louis when every sensible voice I knew was telling me I was not suited for the frontier. I am grateful that you looked at me that first real time when I was watching the hawk, and you saw what I was doing and you sat with it instead of interrupting it." She stopped. "I am most grateful for that you saw me correctly from the beginning." Theodore was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the table in the lamplight with those pale, serious, warm eyes. "You were not hard to see," he said. "Once I stopped listening to what other people said and just looked." She reached across the table and he took her hand. "We built something real here," she said. "We built something that will last," he said. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass, and the creek ran in the dark, and the enormous Kansas sky held its stars above the land that was theirs, 160 acres of grass and water, and everything they had made of it, everything they were still making. They sat together in the lamplight for a long time. The years that followed were years of quiet, deepening abundance, not the dramatic abundance of sudden fortune, but the kind that accrues slowly and certainly, like interest on a careful investment. Each season adding to what the last had built, each year more settled and more fully realized than the one before. Theodore expanded the herd modestly in the good years of the mid-1890s, always within the margin that Elsie's careful accounts defined, and the ranch grew in reputation as well as in livestock, the Walker name becoming associated in the county with the reliable quality of their cattle and the fair dealing of their transactions. Elsie's consulting work continued to expand, though she kept it manageable and refused any arrangement that would take her away from the ranch and the children for extended periods. She was occasionally offered positions in town. Gerald Holt, who had by this point grown genuinely fond of her in the gruff, practical way of a man who shows affection through professional respect, mentioned more than once that he would pay her handsomely to come back full-time, and she declined these offers politely and without apparent regret. Her real work, as she understood it, was the ranch, and the children, and the careful ongoing project of the life she and Theodore were building together. She wrote every day in her journals, and she read everything she could get her hands on, and she talked with Theodore every evening about whatever was worth talking about, which turned out to be most things. James, at 10, was already more knowledgeable about the natural world of the Kansas plains than most adults who had lived there their whole lives. He had filled 2 journals of his own with bird observations by the age of 11, and Theodore, on one of his trips to Wichita for supplies, brought back a book on ornithology published by a naturalist at the University of Kansas, and James read it from cover to cover in 4 days and had opinions about it. Elsie read it too, and they discussed it together with the seriousness of a teacher and student who have long since moved past that distinction and are simply 2 people who think carefully about the same things. Ruth, at 8, had the particular social intelligence of a person for whom other people are the primary field of interest, and she was kind in the unself-conscious way that only the most genuinely kind people are, not because she had been taught to be, but because she was constitutionally incapable of indifference to anyone in her vicinity who was unhappy or in need. She brought home stray animals and also stray children, and the kitchen table of the Walker household was regularly occupied by a varying assortment of neighborhood young people who had found their way there for reasons that were sometimes practical and sometimes simply because Ruth Walker had invited them, and the Walker home was warm, and the food was good, and nobody was going to make you feel unwelcome. This was Elsie's doing as much as Ruth's instinct. She had decided, when the children were small, that the home she made was going to be the opposite of the frontier world's instinct to exclude the quiet and the different. It was going to be a place where people could be precisely and only what they were, and be valued for it. She was not sentimental about this. It was a deliberate choice, made with clear-eyed knowledge of what the world outside the ranch's fence lines could be. Theodore understood this without needing it explained, because he was the same kind of person in the same kind of way, and because their home was also, in important measure, a reflection of the fact that 2 people who had been underestimated and overlooked had found each other and built something that did not underestimate anyone. In the fall of 1895, James turned 10 and Ruth turned 7, and the ranch had its best year to that point. A combination of good rains, well-managed grazing, and the careful genetics of Theodore's breeding decisions producing a cattle sale in September that was the most profitable they had had. Elsie did the figures 3 times to make certain she had not made an error, and when the figures agreed with each other on all 3 attempts, she put the ledger down on the kitchen table and called Theodore in from the barn. He looked at the numbers, then he looked at her. "We're all right," he said. "More than all right," she said. "How much more?" "Enough," she said, "to put a real roof on the barn which you have wanted for 2 years and which I have been making you wait for. Enough to add the room onto the house that we have also been waiting for. And enough left over that I want to put into reserve, because I do not trust good years as far as I can see them." Theodore looked at the figures again and then at her, and his expression was the full, unguarded one that she still sometimes caught her breath at, even after 12 years of marriage. "Elsie," he said. "Yes," she said, knowing what he meant without needing him to finish. "You are the most extraordinary person I know," he said. "I am the person who does your accounts," she said. "You are the person who does everything," he said. "And I do not take it for granted for a single day. I want you to know that." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know that," she said quietly. "I have always known that." He came around the table and kissed her on the top of her head, which was something he did when words were insufficient, and she put her hand on his arm and held it there for a moment. The room was added to the house in the spring of 1896. A proper study for Elsie, with shelves Theodore built himself from good lumber, and a second window that caught the western light in the afternoon, and a desk large enough for the journals and the account books, and the correspondence that had accumulated over 13 years of building a life. She sat in it on the first evening after it was finished and looked at her shelves and her desk and the western light going gold through the window, and she felt a particular quiet satisfaction that was her specific variety of happiness. Theodore appeared in the doorway. "Well," he said. "It's perfect," she said. He looked around the room with the expression of a man surveying completed work and finding it good. "The shelves are level," he said. "I measured 3 times." "I noticed," she said. He looked at her. "I learned that from you," she smiled. "Measure 3 times and cut once. I thought the phrase was measure twice." "I prefer the margin of safety," she said, and he laughed. The warm, open laugh that was still, after all these years, one of her favorite sounds in the world. By 1897, both children were in the school that had been established in Caldwell proper. James at 12, demonstrating the quiet, methodical intelligence his teachers found either impressive or baffling depending on their own natures. And Ruth at 9, becoming the social center of her class, with the unforced ease of someone who never met a person they were not interested in. They rode to school together on their ponies, James ahead and Ruth beside him, and talking continuously while he listened with what his parents recognized as genuine attention dressed in apparent tolerance. Elsie and Theodore had the mornings to themselves during the school months, and these became precious to both of them. A particular, peaceful time in the well-worn routines of the house and the ranch, with the familiar comfort of 2 people who have learned each other completely, and are still, after all that learning, finding new things worth paying attention to. She continued to read voraciously, ordering books from Wichita when she could, and she and Theodore had developed the habit of reading the same books so they could discuss them, which produced conversations of a quality and depth that she would not have predicted finding on the Kansas plains when she had first stepped off the stagecoach in 1882. She had been wrong about a number of things in those early days, she was willing to admit in retrospect. She had thought the frontier might offer practicality and space, and the clean challenge of difficult work. She had not anticipated finding, in the middle of all that sky and grass, the kind of intellectual companionship that she had not been sure existed for her anywhere. In the spring of 1898, they had a conversation about the future that was, like most of their important conversations, conducted quietly and without drama at the kitchen table in the evening. James was 13 and already working beside his father with the skill and judgment of someone 3 years older. He was going to be a rancher. It was not a question that needed asking. He was of this land in the way that some people simply are, as if the soil had been waiting for their specific attention. Ruth was 10 and had announced in December that she intended to be a doctor, which had been met with silence from James and with complete seriousness from both her parents. Dr. Patton had been the person who mattered most to her after her own family since she was old enough to observe him working, and she had been following him on his rounds with his amused permission since she was 8, and she was already reading his medical texts with a focused attention that was unmistakably her mother's, regardless of the volume she did everything else at. "It is possible," Elsie said at the kitchen table, in response to Theodore's quiet question about what they were hoping for. "Women are being admitted to medical colleges. There is one in Chicago. It would require planning and it would require money that we will need to save for, but it is not impossible." Theodore looked at her. "She'd be far away." "Yes," Elsie said, "she would." She paused. "She would also become exactly what she is meant to become." He was quiet for a moment. "Like you," he said, "coming here." "Like me," she agreed. He nodded slowly. "Then we planned for it," he said, and so they did. The last years of the 19th century moved through the Walker Ranch with the rhythm of well-established lives. The seasons turning, the cattle coming and going, the children growing with the disconcerting speed of children in their older years. The country around them was changing too, the wild and provisional world of the 1882 frontier becoming the settled, structured world of approaching statehood and increasing order, with more fences and more railroads and more towns and less open land, and the particular way of life that had defined the cattle drive era becoming something that people were beginning, with nostalgia, to call history. Theodore and Elsie watched these changes with the considered attention they brought to everything. They were not sentimental about the past. Neither of them was a sentimental person, But they understood what was being lost as well as what was being gained. And the journals Elsie kept through those years are, in their careful, unflowery way, one of the clearest records that exists of what the plains actually looked and felt and smelled like in those transitional decades. On the 1st of January 1900, they stood together on the front step of the house they had built and looked out at the land in the cold, clear morning, and Elsie said, "A new century." "Yes," Theodore said. "I have been on this land for 17 years, she said. "Almost to the day." He looked at her. "Does it feel like 17 years?" She considered it. "In the way that something you have built feels old," she said. "Not in the way that time lost feels old. In the way that something real and solid and properly made feels like it has always been there." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they looked at the land together. The grass, still winter-brown, the creek line marked by the bare cottonwoods, the sky going pale gold in the east where the sun was coming up. A red-tailed hawk was turning against the light, riding a thermal upward in slow, precise circles. "Red-tailed," Theodore said. "See how it's holding that inside wing?" She turned and looked at him. "I remember the first time you said that to me," she said. "So do I," he said. "You were sitting on the back step of Gerald Holt's store watching it by yourself, and I came around the corner and you looked up at me without any surprise at all, and I thought, here is someone who is not afraid of anything." "I was afraid of many things," she said. "Not of the hawk," he said. "Not of the silence. Not of being exactly who you were." She looked at the hawk for a moment. "No," she said, "not of those things." He held her more closely in the cold morning air. "I told people," he said, "before I had said much of anything to you, I told Jim Brennan, I think, and maybe one other person, that you were the most interesting person who had come to this town, that your silence told me more than most people's talk." She looked up at him. "You never told me that." "I'm telling you now," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the hawk and the sky and the land in the new century's first morning light. Then she said, "Theodore." "Elsie," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me right." He pressed a kiss against her hair, warm and unhurried. "You were never hard to see," he said, "not for a single day." The hawk turned once more against the gold sky and then tipped its wings and sailed north over the winter grass. And they watched it go. And then they went inside to the warm kitchen and the life they had made. And the door of the house they had built with their own hands closed behind them against the cold. And in the new century's first morning, the Walker Ranch stood solid and real and entirely their own on the Kansas plains. A thing of quiet depth and lasting substance, built by two people who had learned, between them, that the most important things are usually the things that do not need to be shouted. James Walker would go on to take over the ranch and expand it thoughtfully over the following decades, never overreaching, always measuring 3 times. He married a quiet woman from Wichita who loved birds the way he did, and they had 3 children of their own. Ruth Walker graduated from the Women's Medical College of Chicago in 1908, the youngest in her class, and returned to Caldwell to practice medicine for 4 decades, becoming the most trusted physician in the county, and eventually, a legend of sorts, the girl who had grown up following old Dr. Patton on his rounds and had gone to the city and come back better equipped than anyone had imagined possible. Theodore and Elsie Walker grew old on their land in the particular, fortunate way of people who chose correctly and worked patiently and loved each other honestly. The journals Elsie kept filled a cedar chest by the time their grandchildren were old enough to read them, and those grandchildren would read them and find in them a clear, careful record of a real life, fully lived, on the wide Kansas plains. And every morning of every season, on the north section of good grass with the creek along the eastern edge, the red-tailed hawks turned against the enormous sky, and if you were quiet enough and patient enough and willing to simply look, they would tell you everything they knew.